Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this online webinar today. Let's get ready to go. So first of all, I'd like to do a short introduction on our end. My name is Ben Atherton. I run publisher SMB EMEA, which means I'm responsible for the torso and long tail of small and medium businesses in EMEA. We also have Alistair here today, who is a product solutions manager, and Alistair is responsible for onboarding and maintaining technical integrations for managed publishers at Audience Network. So, welcome. If you are in the webinar tool, please use the Q&A feature on the right-hand panel to let us know whether you're already monetizing with Audience Network, or if you're new to our platform. This means I can adjust the information and the pace during this webinar. While I'm delivering the session, if you have any questions, please do send them across. We will try to answer them during the webinar and at the end of the webinar. So the more questions you pose earlier on in the webinar, the more likely is you'll have a good answer to your question. So, first of all, an introduction to Facebook. As you may already know, Facebook's mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. Here at Audience Network, what that means is that our mission is to empower publishers to make meaningful connections between people and businesses. And in terms of how seriously we take that as a mission, in 2017, we paid out over $3 billion to publishers, which makes us a pretty big player in the ecosystem. So I wanted to start with an understanding of what our key differentiators are at Audience Network. First of all, we have a very deep demand pool of Facebook advertisers. We have some 7 million small businesses, medium-sized and large businesses who advertise on Facebook, which makes it one of the largest demand pools in the world. Secondly, the way that the network is built is to optimize for advertiser value. So what this means is when we match an ad to a user in one of your apps, we're making sure that we try to match the most relevant ad to that user. And the events that we're looking for are for that user to engage as heavily as possible with that ad, deeper into the funnel, whether it's an ad for an app install, that might be mean going to an app store, it might mean downloading, it might mean playing. If it's an app for a retail partner, it might mean going to an e-com store, it might mean putting items into baskets, it might mean going to checkout. Thirdly, we have high quality targeted ads matched with Facebook users only. So the quality just doesn't come in the type of brands and the quality of production of the ads that we have, but it also comes in the actual experience itself. When you experience rewarded video or interstitials or native delivered by Facebook, that generally tends to be a very high quality, market leading type of experience that puts the user at the center of the experience. And then lastly, one of the things I'd really like everybody to remember from this webinar is that we have a leadership position in revenue per impression, specifically in rewarded video, where in general, we lead the market. And we're also very close to the competition in interstitials. As expected, we deliver ads across a variety of surfaces, whether it's app, whether it's mobile web, whether it's desktop web, also Facebook surfaces, and we deliver a number of formats within those surfaces. So moving on to how the market looks at ad formats and how consumers look at ad formats. We've done some research on gamers, and what we see in that research is that the highest quality perceived formats are rewarded video, native, and playables. And also those formats, especially rewarded video and native, are seen as the least disruptive. And this is important for you as a publisher, as an app developer, as an app designer. When you're designing your user flow, we believe it's important to insert the types of ad formats that your users are going to like the most. So, moving on to the basics of optimization. First off, how do we enhance revenue on Audience Network? Well, typically when we look at revenue, we're looking at impressions times eCPM. And what's important when you look at that is to look at the whole flow from the app level all the way down to the yield level. So if we look at this chart, the key elements for impression optimization are laid out on this chart. This is all fairly obvious, but it's worth looking at in order to understand that you might be missing some of these steps when you're integrating into Audience Network and when you're optimizing on Audience Network. So first of all, perfect sense. If you have a large portfolio of apps, and typically a lot of our publishers have 10 to 20 apps, the more apps you integrate, the more revenue you're going to make. And then obviously, if you integrate both platforms, iOS and Android, that's going to contribute as well. User engagement is critical. So the more daily users and the more monthly users you can send us, then obviously that's going to drive revenue as well. That's the traffic sent to Audience Network. And then I wanted to come on to match rate and fill rate and show rate. So these are three important metrics to think of. So match rate. This is very important because Facebook only serves ads to Facebook users. So when you send us a request from your app and you request an ad from Facebook, what we do is we make sure we match with a Facebook user. So if that request from your app is not a Facebook user, then we will not show an ad in any circumstances. Additionally, this is why it's quite valuable in your app design, when you're at the design phase, to use Facebook login. Because Facebook login ensures that you're going to get an ad shown to you by Facebook, and often that will have a positive effect on your CPM. Fill rate we'll come on to a little bit more in a minute, but obviously the more valuable your users to Facebook, then the more likely the fill rate will be higher. Show rate is obviously which ads you decide to show. So you may request in any one day, say 1,000 ads from us, and depending on what your user does within the app, you may only show 700 of those apps. So 700 over 1,000 is 70%, and that would be the show rate, and that's in your control as the publisher. And you put those together and you get revenue, of course. So moving on, setting the foundation for best practices in optimization. So we have the SDK, we have ad spaces, we have ad caching, and they lead to better ad experiences. The SDK is something that's not spoken about that much. We're currently on SDK 5.3 at Audience Network, and we update the SDK regularly, maybe 4 to 6 times a year. What you find is there is great value for you as a publisher to always have the latest SDK, because often just having the latest SDK will not just bring more stability and more features, but will actually drive revenue. So for the half an hour or so it might take to download and configure the SDK, you could effectively get a revenue benefit. So it's always worth having the latest SDK. And you can see in Monetization Manager whether you have the latest SDK or not in the notifications on the home page when you load Monetization Manager. Monetization Manager, for those of you who don't know, is the interface by which you can see the performance of your apps and the revenue you earn from Audience Network. So the next thing to do is to look about generating ad spaces. So ad spaces are the places within your app where you will deliver a specific advertising experience. That could be rewarded video, it could be interstitial, it could be banner, it could be native. We're not going to go into detail in this webinar about ad space location, but in a couple of slides time, we're going to talk about some useful places in the app within the user flow to think about where ads really work for your users, where they're non-interruptive, where they're additive to the game, where there's a fair value exchange. And I mentioned a game, you may not have a gaming app, you may have another type of app. Caching ads is something, again, which is a piece of housekeeping that isn't talked about a lot. but for obvious reasons, you don't want your users waiting for an ad. You want the latency to be invisible to the user, hence why you should cache ads. And all this leads to better ad experiences. So here's some examples of what to do and what not to do. Some of these examples are very obvious, but sometimes it's worth stating the obvious so we can avoid common mistakes. So the first piece of advice here is to avoid an overwhelming amount of full screen ads. Obviously, the best thing to do is to have an ad load, so the number of ads a user sees per session or per defined amount of time, which is quite low. So you can see from the example here, there's too many ads in a very short space of time. Not a good idea. Second thing, please avoid full screen ads at unexpected stages in the game. This is a word game, and obviously you haven't filled in that particular level of the word game, but an ad has been served in the middle screen here, shown on the wider screen. Obviously, that's not a great place to put an ad. It's much better to put it at the end of a specific level. Accidental clicks. Please make sure that when you define the click zone within your app, it's very closely associated with the X out on the ad in this case, and it doesn't bleed into other parts of the ad screen. And what we're really after is intentional clicks. That's what you're after, that's what we're after. So advertisers want to know that if someone's clicked through to an app install page, the app store, an e-commerce site, a brand site, they want to know that that's a deliberate action on the user's part and not an accident. So onto revenue maximization, obviously something that should be and possibly is top of mind for everybody on the webinar today. There are some advice here of the flow types that are useful to think about where to put your ad. This is the slide I referred to earlier on. There are many opportunities within most apps to put in ads in a way that is not disruptive and where the user will potentially be more engaged with the advertiser. I'm not going to go through all of these now, but an obvious one is when you've finished a level and you're not about to go into the next level. That's an obvious place for multiple ad formats, but there are many more, as you can see on this chart. Here's some best practice around rewarded video. So if we go back to the word game earlier, imagine step one, the user has completed the 5 fields of the word game, 3 words of 3 letters, 1 word of 4 letters, 1 word of 5 letters, and wants to carry on the game and wants to go to the next level. Here's a good opportunity to offer a rewarded video for a user. The user can then choose to watch the video to get a reward, which might be to get to a harder level of the game, or they can choose to skip the video and continue earning the harder level of the game within the game itself, which might take more time. If the user chooses to view the video, obviously that starts and initiates, and if you've cached it, initiates straight away within your app. And when you've viewed the video, you can claim your reward and you can move on to the next level in the game. That's an example of a really good placement for rewarded video. So, in summary, rewarded video best practices. 1, have a descriptive entry point so the user knows that a rewarded video is coming up. 2, aim for a quality ad experience, thinking about where that entry point is within the game flow and hopefully making that as natural as possible. And 3, informative messaging, making sure the user is always in charge and they feel that they're in charge of the ad experience, referring specifically to rewarded video. So I referred very early on in the webinar that Audience Network has a leadership position in CPMs for rewarded video in main markets. Now, as we know, if we look at the gaming sector in particular, most publishers are developing for the US market. And what we see from some of our case studies is a very significant increase in cost per thousands with Audience Network rewarded video versus other networks. So here's a couple of examples from Playrix and from Pretty Simple. Moving on to interstitials. Again, where you place interstitials in your app is super important if you want to ensure that your user is highly engaged. And once your user is highly engaged, they're likely to interact with the ad more often and more deeply. And that means overall your CPM should be higher because we should be valuing your audience higher. So here's another example. At the end of a game, once you've received congratulations, it's a good place to put an interstitial because there's a natural pause in the game. Ad caching. This isn't actually our presentation that isn't working. This is actually a slide. So this slide is just here to demonstrate that no user wants to have this experience in the app. And I'm sure you as a publisher don't want to have this experience in the app. So this is here simply to demonstrate that ad caching is a fairly straightforward thing to do, but obviously can have a huge benefit if you do it and a disbenefit if you don't. So that's our little encouragement for everybody to cache ads. Obviously, you leverage ad caching to reduce latency. Another piece of guidance that's quite clear is to ensure that ads are actually viewable. We have a large number of tools at Facebook, and one of those tools is to understand viewability of ads. So if you have a vertical scrolling app, please ensure that you don't create the ad space below the fold and it's created above the fold, so we have 100% viewability of that ad. And then the last major piece of advice is bringing video to your app or property. Why bring video? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We know from the way consumers respond to video in advertising and outside of advertising for that matter across the whole of the family of Facebook apps, that video is the preferred consumption model for the vast amount of content and numerous other types of delivery of advertising. So if you can install video, whether by rewarded video or whether by an interstitial video, you're likely to see higher CPMs and higher yield and higher revenue overall per impression. So in summary, how to get started on video, make sure you've got the latest SDK. It's going to be the most stable and potentially you're going to have revenue benefits as well. You need to create the placement within Monetization Manager, and you need to include video under media types as well. So I'm just going to take a brief pause there, and then we're going to come on to talk about bidding. A number of you may already have heard about bidding. So bidding is where Facebook is committed to driving transparency in the marketplace, in the ad tech marketplace, the way that you get ads from demand partners. Currently, most people use a waterfall, as most of you will. The limitations, of course, of the waterfall are there's limited competition, there's no transparency, and there's high cost. So to bring that to life, in a waterfall, if you have demand partner 1 at the top of the waterfall, and demand partner 1 values your request in rewarded video at $10, and demand partner 2 values your request in the waterfall at $20, and when you call demand partner 1, they are willing to fill that request at $10, there's an opportunity cost there of another $10 that you've lost on that impression. That $10 meaning that if you had a bidding scenario where multiple demand partners are called at the same time, your bidding partner will be able to see that demand partner 2 values that request at $20. And instead of giving that impression to demand partner 1, which values it at $10, you would gain the $20 cost per thousand for that specific request. So bidding makes for a fairer marketplace where the publisher sees all the bids come in from all the partners and can ensure that every impression gets the maximum value for that impression, because the demand partners are fighting to be able to fill that request and are therefore competing amongst each other to pay more for that impression. We have a number of case studies on bidding. Here's one from TailFun, where this publisher saw a 20% increase in revenue from bidding. Bidding is still fairly early in the marketplace. we're going to see more popularity throughout 2019 and 2020. But if you want to drive more revenue per impression and overall yield, I'd encourage you to look into bidding. There are resources on the Audience Network website that offer several ways with which you can integrate bidding. We have an in-house kit, and we also work with third-party partners like Google and MoPub to deliver bidding. We have header bidding for mobile web, we have real-time bidding for app, and we have the integration partners I mentioned, and with whom we have an aligned code of conduct. Next up, price controls. Price controls are a very important tool by which you can optimize your revenue. If you're currently not using price controls, by implementing price control model that's good for your app across multiple countries where you will have audiences, should increase your revenue significantly. It's not unusual to see increases of between 10 and 30% simply by implementing price controls. Bringing video to your app or property, we mentioned before. So price floors are what the market generally works with, but what we work with is price targets. So the question here is, what is the difference between price floors and why does Facebook Audience Network work with price targets? Well, price floors are where you set in your mediation platform to accept offers for a specific placement that only hit a price floor or above. So you may say, rewarded video in the USA for my app, I'm only going to accept $20 or above. That means if a bid comes in at $19.99 from a demand partner, that's rejected and you don't get that bid. One of the values of price targets is that we help maximize revenue by giving you greater control to set price targets that allow us to accept bids below $20 as well as above $20, which means that your yield will increase because your fill will increase, and your fill will increase because you'll be accepting more bids below the $20 price target. But when you add all those impressions together, they either hit or exceed the price target. So the benefits are you can better forecast your ad revenue. You can implement country-specific targets with ease within Monetization Manager. That means you can have one set of targets for the USA. You can have another set of targets, say, for Western Europe and high-paying Asian markets. And you can have another set of targets for third-tier markets. I mentioned earlier how price targets differ from price floors, and I think it should be quite clear. But if you have some time and resource, perhaps only as much as 1 to 2 days a month to look at the ad operations on your app, I would highly recommend that you implement CPM targets, price targets within Monetization Manager. Once you've got used to the interface, it should only take you 30 minutes to set up price targets, say, for example, for 20 placements. So that's time well spent that should significantly increase your revenue. If you are extremely time constrained, perhaps you only have a couple of hours a month to work on ad ops, we would recommend that you accept all prices. And that's only if you monetize it alone with Audience Network. But if you monetize with multiple demand sources, say with Google, with MoPub, with IronSource, with AppLovin, with Unity, we strongly recommend you use price targets because of the reasons I mentioned earlier around Audience Network paying a premium, a market-leading premium for rewarded video in particular. It's not unusual for us to see very, very high CPMs delivered by Audience Network for gaming apps that have audiences in the US. So 5 steps to set up CPM targets. 1, first of all, if you can pull a report by placement country for all your demand sources for the last week in an Excel sheet or CSV, then you can see what everybody's delivering, how much volume they're delivering by placement, what CPM they're delivering by placement, and what fill they're delivering by placement. If you then put audience network around 10 to 20% higher than your top line item, specifically for rewarded video. So if your top line item, let's say you're using MoPub, is AdMob at $35 or $40. If you put audience network at $40 or $45, then you should see better fill at that level, which drives your yield overall. Set up country targets for your top countries. So often people put US in a category of its own, which has specific CPM targets for placements. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you might have a tier 2, which is Western Europe and high-paying Asia, and a tier 3, which is rest of the world. And then run those placements for at least 7 days with your set CPM target. Typically, it takes our systems several days to calibrate the value of your audiences at specific CPM targets. So I would actually recommend to run that for at least 7 to 10 days to understand that you're getting a fully calibrated price that is sustainable for the CPM targets you set. And then after you've seen your initial results, review the data, identify further ways to optimize, perhaps by changing the CPM targets by region, by placement. So the next level is to use what we call the sandwich model. The basic principle of the sandwich model is that you call a demand source, audience network, multiple times. And the value in this is that you should be able to see a very high CPM at the top of the waterfall eat up a small percentage of your requests. Now, what we see here is a waterfall going from $25 to $17. But again, if we look at the gaming audience in the US, it's not unusual to see a waterfall start at $60, $70, even $80. So you might call audience network first in your waterfall at $80, and we might only fill 5% of those impressions, but it's much better than filling 5% of those impressions at $40. Then you might call an AdMob or an AdMobbing or a Unity second at $60 or $40, and then you might call an audience network second at $35, one source or two, and then an audience network again at a lower level. Typically, we see these types of sandwich model optimizations drive revenue between 10 and 30%, simply by creating this model of calling audience network and other demand sources multiple times within the waterfall. And again, if you think about how many times you might call a specific demand source or a set of demand sources, this is another reason why caching is so important. So there's no latency. All this waterfall action is happening before the user actually has clicked to see an ad, or whether before an ad like an interstitial has been served. We have some tools to optimize CPM targets, which we're going to come to in a webinar in the future. I've got a few slides left. I just wanted to share some client testimonials with you all. I know we've been answering a few questions, but we still have Alistair here who can answer some more questions. So please do enter some questions in the web chat now, and you'll get a very qualified answer that hopefully will help you with your optimization of audience network. So some testimonials. Calibri Games is an idle casual publisher from Berlin. They've been working with us since 2018, and they've worked very closely on their optimization strategy with CPM targets, and they've seen a huge amount of success placing audience network at the top of the waterfall with what they call an extremely aggressive CPM price target, which is not that different to the numbers that I quoted a couple of slides ago. And they've found this, as they say, to be hugely successful. Also, Fingersoft, another gaming pub. Fingersoft saw their daily revenue with audience network almost double simply by using CPM targets. And they said almost immediately, so that's a matter of days. They also found the implementation straightforward and quick. So what they've done, obviously, is maximize their earning potential from every single ad impression. And that's what we want all you guys to do through using price targets, CPM targets. Lastly, I'm going to refer to A/B testing. So what should you A/B test? Why should you A/B test? And how should you A/B test? It's not always easy to find an optimal setup. And in the environment we're in, we can see significant benefits through A/B testing of placements by country, for example. So, as you guys will know, an A/B test is an experiment, a structured experiment that's designed to test a specific hypothesis with single variants that are repeated to understand whether that hypothesis works or not. Obviously, you need randomized samples, you need a test group, a control group, and you need the volume to be of statistical significance. So, for example, here's a native ad that was shown in 2 countries at 2 different levels of CPM with 2 different layouts. And what we saw is a significant difference in the CPM that was available across those countries. Large button versus small button. So even really small changes like this can have a significant difference, significant benefit if you A/B test them to your overall yield. The type of things that you should be testing are super important. Obviously, the location of the ad is one of the most important ones. So how does the ad fit into the user flow? Is it additive to the user flow? Is it non-disruptive? Does it work in a way that the user sees it as a fair value exchange? That's a super important one to A/B test. And then things we should be testing: bigger or smaller screen elements, frequency or ad load. What is the daily frequency cap for your ads? Typically, we'd recommend you wouldn't have frequency of perhaps more than 12 to 15 per day per user. And video settings. Are you using video, and is video optimized for you? So, a couple of key takeaways coming very close to the end here, and then we can take questions. Monetization starts with the advertiser. We are configured for advertiser value. So that means we are optimized to deliver the best possible advertiser value through Audience Network. What that means is the better designed your user flow is with ads within the user flow, where the user has the most control, where the ads are the least disruptive. What that means is you're going to see better performance from your users for advertiser value. And that in turn means over time, you should see greater CPMs and therefore better yield, also better fill. If you only think of 3 things to take away from this webinar today, please think of the following 3. Find a way to get video into your user flow and as ad formats. If your key ad formats can be rewarded video and video interstitials, you're on the way to maximizing your opt-out, because those are the best performing ad formats that users like the most. Secondly, price targets. We've talked about price targets for around 10 to 15 minutes today, and it shouldn't be underestimated that price targets can typically deliver 10 to 30% uplift versus an unoptimized system. And thirdly, as you go through 2019, do have a think about bidding, whether it's an in-house solution that we can give as an add-on to the SDK, or whether it's through a third-party mediation that you're already using, perhaps through AdMob, perhaps through Mopub, perhaps through Fiverr. Have a look at the Audience Network for more information on that, the Audience Network website. And then lastly, test. I think we live in an app environment where testing is very much part of the agile development philosophy, but it does pay to take time to test where your ads appear, how much ad load you might have. Are your price targets properly optimized? Could you change them a little bit? If you're seeing very high fill on a specific type price target for a specific country, maybe you could increase that price target and generate even more yield. So that's it from myself and from Alistair today. We're ready for Q&A. So please post your questions in on the web chat. Okay, so we have a question, which is, why do CPM targets work better than other bid strategy? So it's a very good question. So what CPM targets allow us to do is allow us to segment your audience. So imagine you send us 1,000 impressions. It's quite possible that the top 50 to 70 of those impressions are seen as super valuable to us audience network. And as a result, we're happy to pay a very high premium for those impressions. So a very high premium might be $60, $70, $80, but only for 5 to 10% of those impressions. Then there's a bulk of impressions that we're still happy to pay a good cost per thousand for. That might be $20 to $25, and that might represent 300 or 400 of your requests into us. If you didn't use CPM targets and you didn't put a very high price target for the top 5 to 7%, then you wouldn't capture that value because you wouldn't be segmenting your inbound impressions or inbound requests to us. So that's why CPM targets is so valuable. If you look at the overall pool of impressions you might send to us within any time period, like a day, it's going to increase your yield because you're segmenting them across multiple price targets.
We've got another question coming, Ben, and you were talking about caching a lot earlier. And the question is, can I cache native ads and show later? And that's a really good question, because we mentioned rewarded video and interstitial a lot. We didn't talk about native. And the answer is simply yes. So all ads can be cached on Audience Network. They're done by default. We automatically cache to the device's memory. And you have up to 60 minutes to display that cached ad once you've actually requested it from us.
Great, excellent.
We've had another question come through about where to find documentation on how to implement into an app. So all of our documentation for Audience Network, it can be found on our dev site, which is developers.facebook.com/audience network. We can send that link through to everyone after the webinar. No problem with that at all. Ben, maybe you want to take this one. I'm not actually sure. The question is, hello, could we please say with what strategy of campaign we could create Audience Network placement?
Okay, I think I know what this question is, but I'm going to assume what the question is, and perhaps if I don't answer it correctly, Polina, you could repost the question. But I think if we go back to the suggestions around making rewarded video and interstitial placements, these are the placements that your users are most likely to interact with the most. They're most likely to interrupt the game flow the least, and you're most likely to get the best CPM and fill rate and therefore yield. So I think that's the answer to the question, is use rewarded video and interstitials if you can, interstitial video. But if it's not, as I said, please repost the question.
So there's a question that's probably geared towards you, Ben, again. It's around rewarded video. And it says, why is rewarded video such high quality and performing well for publisher and advertiser?
Okay, good question. I think the main reason is because the user is in charge. So to expand the answer a little bit, obviously we live in a world where we have information overload. The key currency today is actually people's time. So if people are in charge of an advertising experience within an app or anywhere else on the internet, for that matter, it's more likely that they're going to respond. And we see that with the data that we have in Audience Network. And it's not just true for Audience Network, it's true for all demand sources. A question here from Eugene: do you plan to release your own mediation platform? So today we don't. We work with, as I said earlier, we work with Google, we work with MoPub, and we work with Fiverr on bidding. But as you guys will know, Facebook demand is available through multiple mediation platforms beyond those three. It could be IronSource, it could be Admost, it could be any number of mediation platforms where Facebook demand is available. So at the moment, no. And I suppose the other answer there is we believe very strongly that bidding is the right solution for the marketplace for the future, because we believe with bidding, publishers will get a greater percentage of the pie, so more cents per dollar than they do today, and B, a better yield on a per impression basis, because it's a fairer way to price, and the people who have the advantage of being top of the waterfall and not paying as much will no longer have that advantage when bidding is widely adopted.
So we've had a question come in about testing. Someone is seeing 1001 come up a lot. So 1001 is our generic no-fill error. And basically what that means, it can be in several things, but when you're testing and trying to set up your app, it's generally one of these reasons. So number one, you want to make sure that you're logged into Facebook on the device. We won't serve an ad to a device that doesn't have Facebook installed on it, and the user isn't actually logged into it at the same time. Now, the second most common reason is around ad tracking. So on iOS and on Google, there are options on the device to turn off the ability to be tracked by ads. You need those to be turned on, otherwise we won't serve an ad to you. And then it's quite possible that maybe you haven't requested a test ad and that actually we don't have an ad to show you at this time. And that can result in the same no-fill of 1001. So just keep those in mind when you're trying to onboard.
Okay, I don't think we see any more unique questions here. We are going to provide links later, as we've said. We've just seen a new one come in. Is there any impact of use rate on serving next AD to my app in case when the app is cached AD and didn't use it? I think, Alistair.
Interesting.
I think I know what that means, but I think that's one for you to answer.
Yeah, maybe. So if an app crashes and you didn't use the ad, then I believe that ad will be spent. I think the memory will be flushed by the crash taking place. There's nothing to stop you from using an app within 60 minutes in the same session, but if the session ends, then you would have to request new ads.
Then there's another question here about how a particular impression is priced. From Ingrid, why with the same video and same audience configuration do we sometimes get different results, e.g. €1.50 versus €3.59 for an impression, I think is what's meant there. And that's simply because we price requests in real time. So it's quite possible that, for example, in country X at 9 o'clock in the morning, a request from user Y is worth something that's completely different to in country Y at 11 o'clock at night. A request from user Z could be worth 3 times as much. So it's a combination of who the user is, who the request comes from, which is probably the most valuable thing, what country that user is in, and quite possibly other parameters like day part. I hope that answers your question, Ingrid. Okay, I think that's it. So thanks very much for your questions. Really appreciate everybody coming on today. Please do look out for us sending you resources over email. And also, please do take advantage of all the resources that are available at audiencenetwork.com and the Facebook developer site. And we look forward to seeing you again on future webinars. Now, one last thing, we would love you to take part in our survey. It's only 3 questions, and in order to encourage you to do so, we have a $50 Amazon voucher that's going to be raffled as to one of the survey participants. This is super valuable for us to get feedback. So please fill in the very quick 3-question survey after the webinar for a chance to win that $50 Amazon voucher. Thank you very much.